backup copies of computers and data is extremely important. To give you some perspective, I was once told by an insurer that companies that don't recover their computer systems within a month usually go out of business. Now, hopefully you'll never have to face that scenario, but you do need to be prepared. Fortunately, Proxmox VE has a built-in backup solution, and you can use this with an NFS or SMB share on a NAS, for instance. But how do you back up and restore your VMs to a remote share? Well, if that's something that you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, as that's what we'll be going over. Now, because this video is specifically about the built-in backup solution for Proxmox VE, I'm going to assume you already have a remote share configured that Proxmox VE can connect to. Every file server and NAS will have different ways to configure NFS and SMB shares, for instance, so it simply isn't possible to cover them all. But I do have another video available that shows you how to set up NFS shares in TrueNAS, for instance, that Proxmox VE can use. Now, in order to back up our virtual machines, Proxmox is going to need somewhere to actually store the backup files, and there are quite a few options available. Now, what we're going to be doing is to connect Proxmox to a share on a NAS. So to do that, we go to Data Center, and then we click on Storage. Now, in my case, I do have a cluster set up, but the process is exactly the same if you're using a standalone node because of the way that the actual user interface is defined. So to actually attach this to a NAS, what we're going to do is click on Add. And then what we need to select is, well, typically either NFS or SMB/SIPs. Just depends on how you've actually set up that share. So in my case, for the sake of this video, we're going to go with NFS. So I'm going to click on that. Then what it needs is an ID for the actual storage. So I'm going to make this a bit easier to identify by calling it backups. Then what I need is to provide either the IP address or fully qualified domain name of the actual NAS itself. So that's what mine is in the lab. And then what I then need to do is tell it what actual share to connect to by selecting an option in this export field here. So I'm going to click on the drop down menu. It connects over to my actual NAS, and it's showing me various shares available. So I've got one here which has been called PDE backup, so I'm going to select that. For the content, by default it's selecting disk image, so I need to deselect that because all we're interested in is actual backup files, and that's what this is, VZ dump backup file. So we'll select that, and then I'll just click somewhere else, and then that's it. We've defined what content we can store on this actual share. Now I'll just deselect advanced because one of the options you get with advanced is to actually pick the NFS version. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that that is something that's actually auto-negotiated when the actual connection gets done. So I'm just going to leave it at the default. I could lock it down to a specific version. The only trouble is if later down the line we get a new version of NFS, well, I could be stuck with an older version. So I'd rather just leave it to auto-negotiation. Then what we've got up here is an option for nodes. So what you can do is you can actually restrict the share to specific nodes if you want in the cluster. But I want all of my virtual machines to be backed up, so I'm going to leave that actually set by the default, which is to allow all nodes to actually connect. And then by default, this is actually set to enable, so it will connect. So all I really need to do now is just click on the add button, and then off it goes, and it'll actually connect to that NFS share. Now you can see at the moment there's a little question mark where it's trying to connect, and there it goes. It's now actually connected to my NFS share. So all three of the actual nodes are connected to that. And I can click on that just to check. Yep, we've got a connection now. So that gives me now somewhere to actually store backup files. Now, configuring Proxmox to back up your virtual machines to a NAS is pretty straightforward, really. What you want to do is go to Data Center and then click on Backup. And then here you can actually create backup jobs. So to do that, you click on Add. And then we're on the General tab where we've got a node option, which by default is set to all. So all of the actual nodes in your cluster, in this case, would be included in the job. What you can do is click on the drop-down menu. But the only problem I found is that you can't select multiple actual nodes. So it is a bit deceptive. I mean, we've got like server 1 at the top there selected. If I select 2, I'm holding down the shift key. Sometimes it looks as though it's actually selecting multiple ones, but in this case it's not anyway. But the key point is you can't actually set up a job to cover multiple nodes. It's either all of your nodes or one specific actual server, which is a bit of a shame. I'll just click on that. So if I click on the control key, you can see it looks as though I've actually selected 2 servers there, but no, it's only picking one. But in any case, what we want is all of our actual nodes included, because the virtual machines could be moving around over the course of time anyway, from one node to another as part of HA, for instance. So for me, it makes sense to have a job covering anything and everything, basically. Then we've got a storage option. Now, in my case, by default, it's actually picked the backups folder. Click on the drop-down menu, and I could actually select somewhere else if I wanted to, but that is where I actually want to send these backup jobs to, so I'll leave that set as backups. Now, the scheduling option, you've got quite a few choices here. Typically what I like is to back up everything every day. I mean, if you've got very critical systems, then maybe you want to do it on a regular period of time throughout the day. So maybe you want to do it every 2 hours rather than, say, at 9 o'clock at night every day. The thing to point out is that it's actually pretty straightforward once you have a look at these, because if I select every day 2100, what I can do is actually could change that to 0300, for example, because this is all in military time. It's not your AM and PM. That's something to bear in mind. But it's quite easy to change that time. So I find it's easy to probably pick one of the examples that they've got and then just modify it to suit you, for example. But what we're going to do is just an example here. We'll just pick this one, which is 9 o'clock, 9 PM on a night every day. Now, we've got an option for the selection mode, which by default is set to include its selected VMs. So you've actually got to pick which VMs. Fortunately, you can actually select individual virtual machines, but typically you'd have one to actually do everything. The reason being is that as you add virtual machines to the cluster, well, you don't want to get them missed out of a backup job, so it makes more sense to do that. Now, if you've already got a lot of virtual machines on your computer, the flip side would probably be, I would say, exclude selected virtual machines, in which case you want everything backed up except specific ones. So there might be certain virtual machines that you don't want backed up, in which case you would exclude those. But in this case, we're going to go with all. As I say, I don't want to run the risk of introducing a virtual machine into the cluster that just doesn't get backed up. The consequences could be quite severe, putting it bluntly. We then got an option to send emails, so you'd have to put some email in here, email address here of where you want these sent to. And by default, it's actually set to notify always. Now, there is another option here of to actually only send emails if there's a failure. That is quite useful in the sense that if everything's working all tickety-boo and you're not having any problems, then you won't get tons and tons of emails. The only drawback is if the actual email system itself has a problem. It thinks it's sending emails off, but you're not actually receiving those emails. Well, if you go with the option of on failure only, the email might get sent, but you won't necessarily receive it, in which case you won't necessarily know if your backups actually failed. So I'd say it probably makes more sense to just stick with that default of notify always, or it's entirely up to you what you want to go with. We then got an option for compression. Now, the default is actually to go with a kind of a balanced approach of having fast compression. In other words, that way the actual jobs don't take as long to actually back up your virtual machines, but it's also got good compression. So that way you get smaller file sizes. One thing I'd say though is that if you're already doing compression on your NAS, for example, bear in mind is that you're going to have the computer here, whichever node's doing the backup, trying to compress the file, then sending it off to the NAS, which in turn will then try and compress the file again. You can have a bit of a battle going on there. It is possible to actually make things worse by compressing a compressed file, but you're going to get the latency and the job's going to take longer. So it might be more sensible to actually test this on the actual NAS, test it without any compression on the NAS, for example, and do your compression within the backup job. And then as a comparison, leave the NAS to do the compression, then disable the actual compression here just to see which is the better strategy. We then got an option for mode. Now, the default setting is snapshot, which probably makes a lot more sense because the alternatives are suspend and stop. Now, snapshot, what that means is it's going to take a snapshot of the virtual machine and then it'll back that up. That's less disruptive. If you do suspend and stop, well, it is disruptive. So it's a bit of a trade-off because it means that it's going to take a snapshot of the virtual machine at a specific moment in time. So there might be something gets missed, for example, as part of the backup process. But as I said, I think that trade-off is better because you just don't get your virtual machines getting turned off while you're trying to actually do these backups. Now, by default, we've got this job set to enabled, but you can actually disable that if you like. And right at the bottom, I'll just deselect advanced and then select it again because that's an advanced option. We've got an option here called repeat missed. In other words, it tries to repeat a job if it's been missed. The only thing to bear in mind is that if you're running your backups at night when there's nobody around, then you don't get any disruption to your users, especially if you've only got one network card. All that heavy backup data that's being transferred across the network doesn't really impact anybody. Now, if something goes wrong and you fix it the next day, if you've got this option actually ticked, you run the risk of all of a sudden the backups then kicking in during the day and causing problems for your users. So it's entirely up to you if you want to go with that. I'm just going to leave that set to disabled. Now, the next tab is probably one of the more important things to think about, and that is in terms of actual retention of your actual backup jobs. It does actually make sense to actually keep multiple copies of backups just in case one gets corrupted or you're into ransomware problems and so on. But the only drawback is you're then going to be using up a lot of storage space. So you've got an option to just to keep all backups, but then potentially at some point you're actually going to run out of disk space on your NAS, for example. Otherwise, you can actually start setting retention, and it really depends on what you want to do. I mean, when you're talking about storing data on your virtual machines, which I prefer not to do, the problem you're going to have is that you'll want to keep a lot of actual backups because you never know how far back someone's going to have to go to retrieve a certain file, for example. So that's why I prefer to actually have the virtual machines with as little data on them as possible. The virtual machines would connect to some remote share to be able to get their data. That way I'm only concerned about the actual virtual machine itself, the operating system, the applications running on it. So I'm doing these backups to actually back up the actual virtual machine itself, not the data that's being used. It's going to be a long time to restore a virtual machine of say 20 gig versus a file of say 20K. If that file is actually on the virtual machine, I've got to restore the entire virtual machine. Whereas if I'm keeping the data separate, well, it's going to be pretty quick to actually restore that data file in comparison. In which case, for me, if all I'm concerned about is the virtual machines, I don't have to keep that many copies of the actual computer. The reason I'd want to keep backups is, well, disaster recovery, something really bad goes wrong and I've got to recover the whole thing, or some other problem, patching problems, configuration changes, and I've got to revert back to an older version. In which case, what I'm going to go with here is I'll keep, say, 3 daily copies and 1 weekly copy. Now, I'm backing these up every day, so hourly doesn't make sense. I could keep a month as well, just to be on the safe side. But if I actually had some sensitive data that I might actually need to actually recover at some point, I might put in, say, keeping, say, like a yearly backup or more. What you use is entirely up to you, but this is what I'm going to go with. I'm just going to keep the last 3 days, the last week's copy, and the last month. Now, one last thing is the actual note template. Now, what this does is to actually create a note against the actual backup job itself. And it gives you some examples down here what you can actually put in, but by default, it actually stores the actual guest name. So you can tweak around with this if you like, to just make it easier to actually identify the actual backups when they do get created. But just having the guest name for me is fine. So all I need to do to actually create this actual job is just click on create. And it's now actually created a job. So at 9 o'clock at night, every day, it's now going to back up all of my virtual machines, and they're going to be kept on the actual NAS. And it's also going to be doing pruning. It's only going to keep a certain number of actual backup copies. I mean, I can go back and I can click on edit, and I can make changes to this job over the course of time. I can have a look and click on the job detail to get a bit more information. A useful feature is, well, if you've got the opportunity, you can actually run the job now rather than waiting until the next day, basically, to find out if this has actually worked. The only drawback is, well, if you're backing up virtual machines, which have got relatively large disk space, you've got the problem of a lot of data actually going across the network, which can be disruptive for your users. But if you've got a separate network card for your storage, that's probably not an actual issue for a business even. So it really depends on your circumstances. But what I'm going to do, because this is just a lab anyway, I'm just going to click on run now. I'll just confirm it. And then off it actually goes, and it actually starts backing up my virtual machines. And you can see it's actually running a task against each individual actual virtual machine that's on all three of these actual nodes. Well, as you can see, all three of these tasks have actually now completed. So all three of the virtual machines that I've got should now be backed up. Now, it did take a reasonable amount of time to do this. The only thing to bear in mind is that, well, I've got 3 Proxmox VE nodes here within a cluster, and they're actually virtual machines within a Proxmox VE server. So I've got one actual physical computer that I use for a lab, and within that I'm virtualizing these actual Proxmox VE servers here, so they won't be as fast as they possibly could. I've also actually got a NAS that they're backing the actual files up to, which itself is a virtual machine. So it's a great way to save money if you want to set up a lab. I just need the one physical computer and I run everything virtualized within that. Things run a slightly bit slower, but not that slow. So it saves quite a bit, as I say, on the cost of the actual physical machinery, plus the actual running costs as well. But anyway, the job's actually all now completed. One thing I'll point out is that if I edit the job and then change the mode to, say, include selected VMs, let's say I pick out 2 of them, click OK, this suddenly pops up, show guests without backup job. Click on that, and it actually tells me I've actually got a virtual machine here which isn't being backed up. If I change the mode back to all, click OK, it disappears. So it's a useful alert, and say if you're actually backing everything up and that suddenly shows up, well, yeah, there's a good warning sign to let you know something isn't being backed up. On the other hand, if you're going in the opposite direction where you're actually excluding certain virtual machines, so there's some machines you're deliberately not backing up, either way that would be useful to let you know which of the virtual machines aren't being backed up, so you can find out if you've missed one out in your backup jobs, for instance. So definitely a useful feature, that. And then we've also got this schedule simulator. You click on that, you can play around with the actual schedules, and you can actually find out, so like every 30 minutes, for example. And it actually shows you the actual format if you want to actually start creating your own schedules within the actual job backups. But if you click on simulate, it'll actually show you the actual times that it's actually going to be running these backup jobs, which is actually quite useful, that. Simulate 10 iterations of that, so you'll know if there's certain days you're missing out, certain times you're missing out. It's actually quite useful, that, I must admit, and it gives you the actual details here, so that's useful to be able to copy that and just copy and paste that, I suppose. Copy that, paste that into a job. So copy that, edit that, change the actual schedule to that. So very, very useful, that. But either way, all of my virtual machines should now be backed up. Now, hopefully, you'll never actually have to restore a virtual machine for real, but all the same, you do need to know what the process involves. Now, typically when it comes to restoring an actual virtual machine, it'll be because, well, maybe you're doing some sort of disaster recovery, in which case you're literally starting from scratch, building the new actual physical computers and then restoring the virtual machines. Or maybe the virtual machine is just beyond repair, in which case, well, you have to do a complete restore of it. Now, in this case, I've got 3 actual virtual machines. So what we're going to do is to actually remove this virtual machine, because the trouble is you can't actually have identical computers on the same network anyway. So let's assume this actual virtual machine has been corrupted in some way. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove it. I need to put in its ID and then just confirm that to remove the virtual machine. So what we're going to do is actually remove the file, then we're actually going to restore the actual virtual machine back. So because I want to restore the virtual machine to node 3, what I want to do is to actually click on this backups storage option below node 3 itself. And then what we've actually got to see here is a list of the actual backups that we've been carrying out. Now, what I've done is to actually run the backup job twice. Incidentally, what I'll show you is I did alter the backup job to actually keep the last 2 copies, just so that I can actually show you the sort of layout that you get here. So what you've got is a series of files, and there's the node that you get. That's something you can actually change in that notes template tab. But what you can do is you can actually sort things, so you can actually sort them based on the actual node, which by default is the actual name of the actual virtual machine. So this is quite useful because it then allows me to select these out, so that I've got the test 1 virtual machine, then test 2, then test 3. But if I'm just interested in what's the latest, well, I can just select the date option, for example. But what we're specifically interested in is restoring test number 3. That's the one we deleted. So I need the latest copy of that one. So I'm going to select that file. And then I've got an option to restore. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to click on the restore button. Now, this is the reason why I specifically said we've got to pick out the actual node, because I'm not getting a choice as to where to actually restore the actual virtual machine to. You've got to pick your server first, and then you decide which virtual machine to restore. You don't get a choice in here to pick the specific node to restore to. So it's giving me all the details about that file, and things you can do. I mean, you can limit how much bandwidth gets utilized, so that could be useful if you're in a real emergency, for example, and well, you're at risk of causing problems for existing users because you don't have dedicated storage. You can actually throttle the actual traffic, which could be useful. You've got a unique option which basically randomizes things like the MAC address, for example. If you just hover over it, gives you a bit of details. But when you're restoring an actual virtual machine for real, the last thing you want to do is to actually change that sort of information. You've also got an option to start after restore, which usually isn't recommended, but the option's there. And you've also got these override options. Now, these options that you can change, so the name, the cores, memory, and the sockets, well, it's a bit limited in comparison to what you actually see within the virtual machine itself. I mean, you've got options here where you can go into the hardware and start changing things here anyway. But I mean, I suppose it's a useful way if you want to do some sort of upgrade or something, I suppose. But in this particular case, we just want to restore the virtual machine as is. So I'm just going to sort these out again. I want to make sure that's the most recent version. Again, click on restore. So I'm just going to leave all of these things as is. I mean, you can change the actual virtual machine ID as well if you like. What it's doing, it's just typically when you're creating a virtual machine, for instance, it just picks the next available number. In this case, it's picking exactly the same one as it had before. So when it comes to doing backups, I mean, if the virtual machine ID is that particularly important, it would probably make sense to actually keep an actual track of all the IDs against all of your virtual machines that you've got to make sure that it gets the same ID. In this case, it's not that big of a deal anyway, so I'm just going to leave it at 102. That's what it had before anyway. But what I do need to do now is just click on restore, and then off it goes, and then restores our virtual machine. Well, the restore process has actually finished, and now I've got my virtual machine back. In this case, what I've done is, well, just to make sure that everything was working all tickety-boo, I've actually started up. So what I've now got here is a virtual machine running inside of a virtual machine, running inside of a hypervisor, but it does actually work. clock synced and everything, got access to the applications and a basic default setup for Debian 12. So when it comes to actually restoring a virtual machine, the process is pretty straightforward, because you're either going to be doing this from scratch, or it's a case of, like I said, the computer's actually broken, it needs bringing back from the brink, in which case you just delete the original and then restore its actual replacement. Now, when it comes to backing things up, you do actually have to test that the actual backup process is working. The reason being is you can't just simply have a set and forget process. You can't just simply set up a job like this and assume that everything's going to be tickety-boo and everything's going to work, that you'll be able to restore your actual virtual machines if things go wrong. Reason being is I've actually seen firsthand the consequences where somebody couldn't actually restore a computer, and it wasn't pretty, to say the least. In which case, what you have to do is, aside from setting up a job to regularly actually back up your computers, you also have to regularly try restoring your actual computers as well, just to make sure that everything does work as expected. The only catch is you can't have two identical computers on the network at the same time. They'll conflict with one another. In which case, what you want to do is to isolate any virtual machine, for instance, to a completely separate network. That way it can't talk to anything, it can't interrupt anything, you don't cause any problems. And in the case of a hypervisor like this, that's actually pretty simple to do. So what we want to do is pick out the actual server. And what we're going to do is to create an isolated Linux bridge. So we'll go to System, then Network. I'm going to create a Linux bridge. I need to change the name. I'm going to call this one VMBR10, for example. I'm not going to assign anything to it. I'm just going to give it an actual comment here. I'm just going to call this backup testing and click create. Then click apply configuration. So the idea is that this is a Linux bridge. Normally, there's nothing going to be attached to it. The host certainly isn't. Virtual machines aren't. It's only going to be used purely for when we're doing actual testing of our backup. So now that that's actually created, what I want to do is, let's say I want to do a test for our computer here, test 1. So in that case, I've got to select that specific server, because that's where we want to restore the virtual machine to. I'm going to select my backup storage here. I'm just going to sort these out. So I've got test 1, test 2, test 3. They're my virtual machines. Test 1 is the one we want. I want the latest version, so I'm going to select that specific file. Click on restore. Now, because I'm doing a test, I want to make it a bit easier to identify this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this one 800, because that one is 100. So I'm just going to call this 800 for the sake of argument. You can use whatever numbering you like. Everything else I'm just going to leave as is. I mean, I could limit the bandwidth if there was a potential that might cause problems on the network, for example, but everything else will leave as is, because I want this virtual machine to come back exactly as the original. So I'm then going to click on restore, and then off it goes and starts to actually restore that virtual machine. One key thing to point out, though, is that I definitely don't want this set to actually start as soon as it's actually reloaded. Now, this virtual machine has now been actually restored, and because I've given it a higher number, it goes right to the end of the list. So this makes it easier for me to pick it out. Now, before I do anything else, I need to move this to a different network. So I'm going to select that actual virtual machine, then go to hardware. Now, by default, it's actually set to go to VMBR0 for the network. So I need to select that, edit that. And I need to pick my isolated actual Linux bridge. So we put this into an isolated network, click OK. And now when I actually start this up, it's just going to be completely isolated from the rest of the network, so it won't conflict with the original. Now, in this case, that one's turned off anyway, but the key point is that I could have that one up and running and this one both at the same time, because the original is on bridge VMBR0, whereas our test one is on VMBR10. Go back to the network. As I say, this is completely isolated. Like I pointed out, the actual host itself doesn't even have connection to the bridge, and there'll be nothing else getting used on there except when we're doing these recovery tests for our actual virtual machines, just to make sure that the files work and that the actual backup process works. So the only thing that would be left to do is to basically spin the actual computer up just to make sure that it does actually work. The only thing you have to bear in mind is that, well, because it's actually isolated in this case, if we had a computer that needed authentication through Active Directory, for instance, well, that wouldn't be possible, because there's no way out of that specific bridge. There's no way for it to talk to an Active Directory server, for instance. But the key point is, I'm not really bothered about that. I just want this computer to literally spin up, just for the sake of being able to check that the actual files and everything are intact. As long as it boots up and I can at least log in locally, then we should be pretty much fine, and I'll have the confidence to know that that backup process is working because it's backing everything up to the NAS, and I'm actually being able to actually then restore it from the NAS intact, and it still works once it's back up and running. So a relatively straightforward process. I mean, once it's finished, we could log in, as I say, and test it. But the key thing is, once we're finished, what I would then do is literally power it off and actually delete the virtual machine, because it has no other further purpose really. It's just there to exist purely for the purpose of testing the actual backup process. But it's booted up, so as far as things go, it seemed pretty much fine. So relatively straightforward to do. Now, one of the useful features that you get with this Proxmox VE backup solution is actually being able to manage your actual backup files. So if we pick out one of the servers and then go up to our backup storage, what we've got is an actual series of files here. Now, the backup job that we're running does actually do some pruning. In other words, it's only going to keep a certain number of files, but circumstances change and you can actually manage these files manually if you particularly want or need to. And what you can do, as an example, is we can pick out one of the files here, then click on Remove to actually delete that file. Fortunately, it does come with an actual confirmation check there. But the thing is, you can't actually select multiple files. It's a one-off process. I've got to delete each file individually. Unless that is what you do is pick a file and select the prune option here. So it's prune group, QEMU, and then it's got the actual ID for that specific virtual machine. If I click on that, although we've got a pruning schedule that's set up within the job itself, I can actually make some alterations here. That way I can actually tell it to only keep a certain number of files. So for example, I could tell it only keep the last file, and as you can see, it's going to delete that specific file there. I could tell it to keep the last daily one. Well, those were both done on the same day, in which case it's going to delete that one. The last weekly one, well, those have both been done within the same week, and so on. So that is a way to actually remove other files rather than having to go through them each individually, I suppose. So it is quite useful, especially as, you know, if the backup process changes. Maybe you're running out of disk space and you only want to keep a certain number of files to try and recover some of your storage capacity. Another useful thing you get out of this is that if I pick a file here and click on Show Configuration, it actually comes back and gives me quite a bit of useful information about the virtual machine itself. So that's definitely useful to have. And then one other thing that you get with this is the ability to actually change the note. Now, each of these backup files has got a note attached to it, and at the moment what they're showing is the actual name of the actual virtual machine. Now, that was defined as part of the actual backup process. Within the actual backup job, by default, all it puts in there is the actual name of the virtual machine, but you can edit this afterwards as well. For instance, if you click on Edit Notes, you can put in a specific note there. Bear in mind that the actual backup job itself has a template, so this is an actual specific note you'd literally type it in as is. So you could put extra information in there if you wanted to, but the trouble is, again, you can't select multiple files, which is a bit of a pain. You'd have to do that for each individual file. Now, one other thing I'll point out is this rather useful feature here, Change Protection. Now, I must admit, it doesn't seem all that intuitive to me, and I was clicking this and clicking it again, and honestly I thought nothing was happening. But it's a bit deceptive, because right over here there's a column with a little shield against it. So what this is for is to actually protect a file from being pruned. So maybe there's a specific file or series of files, for instance, that you want to keep, and you want to make sure that they don't get pruned, because that pruning process is automatic. It's part of the actual backup job. But what you can do is you can override that with this change protection option. So I can pick a file, click on change protection, but you see, you just get a sudden flash. As I say, that kind of threw me, and it wasn't until I noticed the little shield pops up. So now that file is actually protected from being pruned. If I click it again, you get the little flash, but then the actual shield disappears. So that's a good way to actually protect backups, because sometimes that is something you actually need to do. But it's a very useful way to actually keep your actual files, because I say you could run into a situation where all of a sudden you just can't back anything up because you just don't have enough storage capacity, for example. So this is a relatively easy way, rather than going to say like the NAS, for example, and deleting files through that. You've got a bit more control, especially with that prune option, for example, to decide what does actually get removed. So yeah, definitely a useful feature. As far as VM backup solutions go, I think this is pretty much all you really need. As long as your backup files are then backed up to some other local storage, such as an external drive and also the cloud, for instance, then this should cover you against most situations. But as I've hinted at before, the goal here isn't to back up data files though, because a restore would take too long if you only want to recover the data. What this backup solution is for is to cover you against a computer outage. In other words, the hardware, the operating system, and any applications installed on it. Bear in mind though, this doesn't offer a way to back up Proxmox VE itself. So, do you regularly back up and restore your VMs? And if so, how do you do it? Let me know in the comments below. Now, if you find this video to be useful, then do consider subscribing to the channel, as that would really mean a lot to me. But it's also a good indicator to let me know how videos like this are helpful to people such as yourself that are watching. In which case, thank you. On the other hand, if you're not ready for that level of commitment, then I'd really appreciate it if you could press the like button, because that way that'll help to get the video out to other people that might find it useful as well.